Are you ready for another chapter in the survey of the Bible? I hope so, because in this lesson we're going to look at the general epistles. They're sometimes called the Catholic epistles, and used in that manner, it means the general epistles, the common epistles, as opposed to the manner like the Catholic Church. That is what the word Catholic meant originally. It meant generic, everyone, all inclusive. The Roman Catholic Church picked a pretty good name, don't you think? Too bad Protestants are afraid to use that. Yeah, I don't use it too much either. I get it. The general epistles, because other people are going to misunderstand, Anyway, the general epistles are sometimes overlooked, probably because dealing with Paul's epistles is a little easier. Paul's epistles are somewhat similar to each other, so we become used to his very personal style. The general epistles, however, were written by multiple different people and therefore have multiple different styles. We don't become as accustomed to the styles, so they aren't as easy to read and teach. Now, some scholars will include Revelation in the general epistles, and that is understandable. I told you in the intro lesson that I am one of those people that I actually like that. Because Revelation is a letter, and it was not written by Paul, so it should be in with the general epistles, in my opinion. However, we'll cover it separately and consider it a book of prophecy. That's how most scholars group the New Testament books. So, plus I like the symmetry of 4 groups in the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, history, poetry, and prophets, and 4 groups in the New Testament, Gospels, Acts, Epistles, and Revelation. Although I divide the Old Testament into 5, so, I don't mind dividing the New Testament into 5 either. It's not important. It's like you can call me Don or Velcro. I don't care. Names are just labels. Just say my name with love. And as I've often said, call me the fat old hairy guy. As long as you say it with love, I'm good with it. Even if you don't say it with love, doesn't bother me. Yeah. So the general epistles basically go from longest to shortest. That's why Revelation doesn't belong in there to the early Christians, because it's longer. It's 22 chapters. Book of Hebrews is 13 chapters. James and 1 Peter are 5 chapters each. 2 Peter 3 chapters, but they kept Peter's 2 books together. John is 5 chapters, and 1 John and 2 John and 3 John are 1 chapter, and Jude is 1 chapter. So, and I don't know if Jude is longer than 2 or 3 John. I haven't sat down to count them. But 34 chapters in the general epistles. All right, I mentioned some time back that we would talk about Hebrews and who wrote it. I do not, the author of Hebrews is unknown. I can say that with a certain sense of strong belief. Some so-called modern scholars believe Paul wrote Hebrews. I would say no, and I'll give you reasons. In the early church, Hebrews was often circulated with collections of Paul's writings, and that's what they go by. However, when the early scholars decided on which books belonged in the New Testament and how they should be arranged, they did not include Hebrew with Paul's writings. How do I know that? I mean, it comes right after Paul's writings, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, boom. But Paul's writings, with the exception of Hebrews, were arranged in order from longest to shortest, and Hebrews was placed after those books. Since the early Christians, much closer in time, to the writing did not place Hebrews with Paul's writings, neither shall we. The book has a very extremely different vocabulary than Paul's writings. The style is also very, very different. Many extensive studies have been done regarding the authorship of this book. This would make an interesting study if anyone is interested. I have done a good deal of that already, and I'd be happy to share it. And by the way, if they had believed Paul wrote Hebrews, it would probably have been placed after 2 Corinthians. So, as the fourth longest of Paul's epistles. Hebrews is a powerfully written book with some extremely deep theological teaching. And yes, Paul certainly could do that. He was a well-educated man in both Greek philosophy and Jewish theology. It's just the early Christians didn't accept Paul as the author. And that's my number one stopping point. But Hebrews was written almost as though it was a sermon, a very well-developed and organized sermon. Many claim the Greek that Hebrews was written in is the most intellectual Greek in any of the New Testament books. We don't know when this book was written, but it was probably prior to 70 AD. Why do we say that? That's because that's when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, as well as Jerusalem. And Hebrews refers to sacrifices in the present tense, which to Jews would only be done in the temple. So the writer of Hebrews was probably writing to Jewish Christians in general. He saw a danger of Christians leaving their faith or becoming indifferent to their faith, which the Jews had done. And I would say today many Christians have become indifferent to their faith. I'm a Christian, I go to church, that's it. No need to get excited about it. I hear stuff like that, and I cry. But the writer of Hebrews saw the danger to that philosophy, that attitude, and the book begins with the discussion of the Son of God. Describes him as our high priest, does an excellent job of presenting Christ as our companion in our struggles, as one who can empathize with us. The writer gives us examples and specific teachings, and I could teach about this for a long time. I've done that in another study. James. This was almost certainly written by the brother of Jesus, and that was what early church tradition says. I see no reason to contradict them. The Apostle James died too early to have written this book. James, the brother of Jesus, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem and was highly respected. So people were going to pay attention to what he wrote. Most scholars believe this book was written around 45 AD, as the first book in the New Testament mentioned before. And almost certainly, almost certainly the earliest book. And this is also based somewhat on the language, some of the language that was being used. James appears to be less of a letter and more of a book of teaching. James, the brother of Jesus, would not have been a highly educated man, although, by this time he's probably 50 years old. He's had time to study. It's now 15 years after. Now, he wouldn't have been 50 years old. But this is 15 years after Jesus died. So Jesus was 30. He was the firstborn, so James would have been, less than 45 years old at this time. Just did that math in my head. It's not my notes. Sorry. So it's less of a letter and more a book of teaching. It, in many respects, feels like the book of Proverbs. Some scholars have made comparisons between James and Proverbs, and those are pretty good comparisons. I like them. Some scholars also compare James, the book of James, to the Sermon on the Mount. And again, I like those comparisons too. A lot of similarities and parallels. The book's focus is on solid moral teaching and Christian fundamentals, with an emphasis on practical applications, which I love practical applications, applying your faith to everyday life. James does that. First Peter was written to Christians Peter had never met. They were in the area that we call Turkey. They call Asia Minor or other names, but put yourself in the place of these Christians. Paul came through and taught them the gospel and established churches. And now Peter, one of the 12, an original disciple and close companion of Jesus, writes them a letter. How encouraging would that be? It makes you wonder how often any of the disciples did this. I doubt this is the only time. They probably did it more often than we know. With mail delivery less often than the regular service we are accustomed to, and with the lack of a printing press to duplicate documents, we just don't see all these types of letters. I wish we could. There were many, many letters and gospels written in the first few centuries that all claim to have been written by Peter. Yet this epistle was accepted as written by Peter without question, while the early Christians rejected most of the rest as not written by Peter. That speaks volumes regarding the authorship being Peter. Scholars generally believe this book was written near the end of Peter's life while he was in Rome. That would take place around 63 to 69 AD. Somewhere just before the Great Persecution, or at least before the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is around the same time as the Synoptic Gospels were written, that major first persecution, or maybe slightly after. Think about Peter's personality. The Gospels brought out that Peter often seemed to speak before he thought. In keeping with Peter's out-front personality, this book deals directly with practical applications of Christianity. He wants his readers to appreciate their salvation and not take it for granted. He wants them to learn to be obedient and practice being holy without taking on airs. Airs, A-I-R-S, without getting high and mighty. He tells his readers to live in the world, but warns them against allowing the world to affect their holiness. Basically, he is saying that we need to be just like Jesus. In fact, it is from this book that we learn the popular modern, or last 30 years or so, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Peter tells us that we can grow through the difficulties we face, and that is important. That he says that is important, how we deal with others. That is how we identify ourselves as Christians, by how we deal with people. Not your friends, not your fellow believers, with people of all types. I over-dramatize Peter, but I think he would have. And my middle name is Peter, so I feel like I can speak for him. 2 Peter has had its authorship significantly challenged over the years, but many scholars still accept it as written by Peter near the end of his life, about the same time as 1 Peter. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise because they were both written to the same people, and because while 1 Peter leaned more towards addressing Christianity and the world, 2 Peter leans more towards Christianity itself. Internal focus on being a Christian. So it's a natural supplement to 1 Peter. Most Christians, even many pastors, don't seem to think about Peter's two epistles being complementary. Or at least I have rarely heard any pastor mention that. 1 John. 1 John is so similar to the Gospel of John. It is clearly, obviously, they were both written by the same man, both in language and content, style. The author of 1 John challenged only by the most liberal modern scholars who disagree with anything ancient scholars had to say. After all, if you want to become famous, you got to come up with something new, whether it's theology or science or whatever. Come up with something new that nobody's ever talked about before, you can become famous. So let's make up whoppers about the Bible. No, not a good idea. First John was probably written near the end of the first century A.D. There are some think it was written before the gospel, and the gospel was just an expanded version of the epistle. Others think the epistle was written after the gospel, perhaps as a summary and or a response to criticism regarding the gospel. Either way, it was written around the same time, anywhere from 90 to 95 AD, and I take no position on which came first. Either one, man, there's so much John in them. Like the Gospel of John, this letter is an obvious argument against Gnosticism. John begins by writing that he was an eyewitness who actually touched Jesus, explaining why people should pay attention to his epistle. A major theme is relationships with others, especially other Christians. Oh, he really brings that home in 1 John. By saying he touched Jesus, John is also refuting one of the false teachings being spread in those days, that Jesus didn't really come from heaven in a physical body, but he only appeared in a spiritual sense. Yeah. John was right there with him. He touched him, he felt him, he heard him, he saw him, he could smell him. I'm not saying Jesus didn't take baths, but walking through the wilderness, he'd build up some sweat. Anyway, 2 John was obviously also written by the Apostle John. It was written about the same time as 1 John in the Gospel. There were many traveling evangelists in those days, and John was warning the churches to be careful about which ones they listened to and to not let anyone take advantage of them. 3 John was very similar, also written by John about the same time as other writings. Again, so much like John that there's very little place to dispute the author. Again, in 3 John, he's warning people about false teachers, deceiving them, taking advantage of them. 2nd and 3rd John were written to two different people. Jude. Jude is another form of the Hebrew name Judah, which in Greek is Judas. Perhaps he didn't want to be called Judas anymore since Judas betrayed Jesus. Kind of like who wants to be called Benedict Arnold in America. If you don't know that reference, shame on you. You should study your history of your country, assuming you're American. The author was almost certainly one of the 12 disciples, based on how it's written. Judas, son of James, not Judas Iscariot, seems to be most likely. He says he is the brother of James. That leaves some thinking that the author was actually Judas, the brother of Jesus. We know that James, who wrote his epistle, was the brother of Jesus. So, maybe that's the way to go, that Jude was actually the brother of Jesus, and he claimed to be the brother of James so that he wouldn't be trying to claim fame that he didn't feel he deserved. He didn't want to seem pretentious and seeking special favor as the brother of Jesus. But we just don't know who he was. This epistle was probably written around 72 AD, just after Jerusalem was destroyed. Could have been before. I don't think so. We don't know who Jude was writing to, but he was obviously writing in opposition to Gnostic teachings, in specific the teaching that Christians should go ahead and sin because their sin will not be held against them. These were probably some of the earlier Gnostic teachers, well before John's writings. Yeah, Paul faced some of that. Romans chapter 6, 5 to 6, the end of 5 going into 6. And also faced it with the Corinthians as well. So what was Gnosticism? Christian teachers throw that word out every once in a while so we can impress you with how intelligent we are. Not my focus, but whatever. Not every pastor that throws out the word Gnostic is doing it for wrong reasons, but so many that I've encountered are just trying to impress people. And they don't always explain it very well either. So let me take time to really give you a good explanation. Gnosticism is a religion that differentiates the evil God of this world, our Old Testament God, they would say, from a more abstract God who was revealed by Jesus, but Jesus was not God. That's what they believed. That's why I say a different religion. Gnostics view this world as a creation made to keep human souls trapped in evil physical bodies. Gnostics teach that only a hidden wisdom that is known only to a very small select group, only those few can be saved, meaning escape from this world by their hidden wisdom. Gnosticism was very widespread and became somewhat influential. People like to feel they're elite and special over everyone else. It's human nature. And there were a great many varieties of Gnosticism. I am not going to go into all of them. I do have another document that does that if you are interested. The form of Gnosticism the New Testament writers were fighting was a relatively simple Gnostic viewpoint that eventually evolved into many, many varieties and beliefs, often primarily based on personal religious experiences, and if that was some dynamic, charismatic individual, they'd get followers. So to attempt to give in-depth doctrinal teachings in this short lesson would be ludicrous. The many versions of Gnosticism are just too varied. I'll list off a few of the more popular ones. Docetism, Marcionicism, Donatism, Montanism, and I'm done twisting my tongue up. In general, Gnosticism typically sounds like salvation requires special knowledge, and that knowledge includes things like God is evil, all matter is evil, and Jesus was not really human, or Jesus wasn't really God, or Jesus only appeared to be human, or Jesus was only partially human. All of them believing only they knew the secret wisdom for salvation. One of the really weird variations that many of them have is that God was perfect, so he couldn't create an imperfect world. So he created another God that was a little below him. And he couldn't create an imperfect world, so God created another God who was slightly less perfect than him, until thousands and thousands of gods later, each one slightly less perfect, and we finally got one that could create the world. They call those emanations. I call it stupid. And in case you're interested, yes, there are Gnostics in our modern world, although they don't all wear that name, or at least not openly. I have recognized a couple of churches in Wyoming, one here in Cheyenne and one in another city in the state, that if they aren't Gnostics, they're pretty close to it. They're kind of out there in many ways. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, so the hidden knowledge. Interestingly, the word agnostic means without knowledge. The word agnostic was first used by Thomas Huxley in 1871. It was to describe his view of God. And by agnostic, he was saying he did not know God in any manner. He opposed the spiritual knowledge as taught by Christians. It was Christians that gradually changed the meaning of agnostic to mean someone who does not believe in God. End of the lesson. I hope some of that was interesting. God bless you. Bye now.